knives. You know, this is classical terrorism that we see. Of course, it doesn't make the news here because nobody here is interested in terrorism that kills people who aren't British or American. We don't even get the news about Pakistan. Every day there are bombs and killings in Pakistan. We never hear about it because one group of Muslims attacks other Pakistani people to aggravate the situation, to create a dictatorial state, and then they can say, oh look, we've got a dictatorship, let's rise up against the infidels.
And why do
That process does exist in China. And the Chinese believe by modernizing the economy, bringing the people into the 21st century, or 22nd in some cases, that they will be able to resolve this problem. I think they will be partly successful, but because of the nature of Wahhabism, it actually develops, best of all, its core in wealthy states. For example, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, where the people who control the oil wealth accumulate such vast power and wealth that they lose all track with reality. And they believe that their destiny as princes, like bin Laden, one of the royal family actually, connected to the royal family, they believe, some of them, that they have a mission to bring to the world a new belief system founded upon ancient beliefs, but using the latest technologies of warfare and communications to smash the old order of society. That's why we get Wahhabism developing in advanced countries, in backward countries, financed by the Saudis and through the madrasas in Pakistan and so on. So there's a dual connection. The wealthiest layers of Wahhabism that finance the operation, and by the way, they spend more money on promoting Wahhabism around the world than the Soviet Union used to do on supporting communism around the world. More money is spent on that. And so the Chinese have seen this as an administrative question and an economic question. Lenin used to say, the national question is a question of bread. If you feed the people, the national question will diminish. If you raise their living standard, the national conflicts will diminish. And after all, why are the Black Lives Matter protests so significant? What does everybody say? They say Black Lives Matter is about inequality. That's what they say. It comes because black people are more likely to die of coronavirus, because black people are more likely to be unemployed, and black people are more likely to be picked up by the police, harassed by the police, beaten by the police, killed by the police, put in prison. And that's a function of the structural hierarchy of inequality. First comes class inequality, and then within the working class, gradations are created based on religion, race, and sex. And those gradations turn one against another in order to strengthen the position of capital as a whole over the mass of the workers.
But you know, the Wahhabis are in cahoots with the Americans and the CIA.
Yes.
But because the Americans, they have a different motivation. They want to deliberately destabilize China. And the Americans and the CIA have a history of wanting to destabilize not just China but Russia. In fact, they helped the civil wars inside the former Soviet Union. They helped Georgia, for example, against Russia.
There is no doubt what you're saying is true. That the main dynamic in the world today is to foster the conditions for war with China.
Yes.
And it is America and Britain who are at the forefront of the campaign to try to destabilize China, using Hong Kong and Xinjiang as excuses, as if Donald Trump and Boris Johnson gave a shit about Muslim people. I mean, look at what they did 2 days ago. On the Muslim Christmas Day, the night before, they turn around to the people in Manchester who are Muslim and say, no Christmas Day for you. All the preparations have been made. And all of a sudden, shut down Manchester, lock it down. Why? And then they say to them, you can't meet in your homes, you can't gather together, but you can go to the pub, where of course the Muslims cannot go. And therefore, they are fostering a mood of anger within the population by their stupidity by the ignorance, by their insensitivity, and by their pursuit of their own self-interest. And in relation to China, that's what they're doing. The British talk so much about Hong Kong freedom, Hong Kong democracy. There was no right to vote under the British. Hong Kong violence by the government. The British under Margaret Thatcher, you can check online, the British Army in Hong Kong under Margaret Thatcher developed a policy of shoot the protesters, shoot them down. That's the British, where there was no democracy for 150 years in Hong Kong. None. And the reason for the problems in Hong Kong is the British. They gave power over the whole of Hong Kong to 4 individuals, 4 wealthy people who own all the land in Hong Kong. And that's why the people in Hong Kong all live 3 or 4 or 5 to a tiny apartment. Tiny apartments. And the reason they're angry is because they've been manipulated by the British establishment and their stooges, who are just like Brits. They even behave like British people, the rulers of Hong Kong, or the old rulers of Hong Kong. And they've witnessed the living standards in Hong Kong going down, while the living standards in neighbouring Shenzhen have risen way, way, way above them. And therefore they felt, we were the kings 30 years ago, and now we're nobody. Nobody likes to be nobody. That's why the Hong Kongers, the biggest joke of all is, what were the protests in Hong Kong about? They rarely tell you this, but if you look at what they were about, it was because one young 19-year-old boy took his girlfriend to Taiwan. He murdered her and put her in a suitcase. And then he fled to Hong Kong. The Chinese tried to extradite him from Taiwan to Hong Kong. Better said, the government tried to extradite him. But there's no treaty between Hong Kong and the mainland and Hong Kong and Taiwan to extradite this murderer. And therefore he remains free in Hong Kong, the murderer. When the Chinese tried to impose a law to have an extradition treaty with Hong Kong, that's when they started smashing up the underground stations, smashing up the shops, pouring petrol on people, on old people, trying to clear away barricades, setting them alight and burning them to death. That is cheered by the West. If that happened in London, the bloody army would be on the streets in a minute. If that happened one time in London, the army would be on the streets. But they're allowed to do it, cheered on and financed by the Americans and British. And then they turn around and say, oh my God. And yet last week, the British, I didn't even know, the British stopped their extradition treaty with Hong Kong. So the British had an extradition treaty with Hong Kong when China's not allowed to have one. The only reason Hong Kong was under British colonial rule was because the British invaded China, bombed China, to force them to take opium. The British were the #1 drug dealers in the world. They exported it from India to China and forced the Chinese to take it. That's why Hong Kong came under British rule. And I don't know what, to be honest with you, I've no idea why the Chinese were so foolish as to allow Hong Kong to remain under British rule. They should have seized it years ago, without any agreement with the British.
Not only that, 150 years ago, the Boxer Rebellion, that was fermented.
I'm criticising you.
120 years ago, the Boxer Rebellion was fermented by the foreigners, by the British, the French, the Germans.
The Boxer Rebellion was 1900.
1901, 1902. Boxer, that killed something like 50 million people.
Well, you see people protest about the statues of Black Lives Matter. If you go down to the Mall and you walk from Admiralty Arch on the right-hand side, the very first monument is to the heroes who suppressed the Boxer Rebellion. And it shows them chopping their heads off and so on. Oh, wonderful, right in front of the Queen. Because Britain has one of the most bloody histories of any country in the world. That's the only reason why Boris Johnson's washing hands might be appropriate is because the British have a lot of blood to wipe off their hands.
I was reading
And therefore, no wonder they end up like Lady Macbeth. That spot, how shall I clean it?
You know, I looked up the numbers. In the Boxer Rebellion, some 15 million people died. I looked at my own country.
That's not correct, actually.
1970 to
Taiping
1919.
Rebellion.
Sorry?
Taiping Rebellion.
1970 to 1919, they came to my country, Iran, and what they did was they sequestrated the food produced by the farmers and they gave it to their own troops and the Indian troops fighting against the Ottomans. And we had the famine that killed 9 million people. Nobody's even heard of it. Nobody's heard of it.
When they talk about Auschwitz, they say, 3 million dead, 6 million dead. When 3 million British, or when the British starved 3 million people to 4 million people in Bengal, at the same time as Auschwitz was happening,
6 million.
of course this was a hero. Winston Churchill, the hero, saved the world. And so you must understand the history of imperialism to contextualize the concept of freedom and the concept of how the world is today, and to locate China within that process. Otherwise you lose track of the world and you fall for all the hysteria, the Chinese virus. In actual fact, I've been looking into this in detail. I'll take you 1 minute. I've been looking at 1 second. You had a lot of chance.
No, what's your sermon?
A lot of shots.
I'd like to know what you're trying to get to.
Now, nowhere. I'm just entertaining the crowd.
No, that's what it looks like.
This is a comedy spot.
I mean, maybe you could, inform us of something that will help us here.
Maybe what?
You could tell us what's your point in all of this.
No, I can't do that. I'm sorry. I don't want to reveal something secret to you. I can't remember. What was I saying?
But not the world.
How are you going to benefit from your talk?
In any case, when the government fails, that's an act of communism.
The coronavirus. I was going to say. Oh, right.
When the government buys
So they
up
said
stocks,
here, first of all, you may remember it, you can look back on the BBC website. They were constantly saying the Chinese virus from Wuhan. They implied, even the BBC, the ones who say fake news, conspiracy theory, fake news. I saw a broadcast by them only last month where they had a journalist standing in front of the Wuhan virology lab. And he's going, look, they won't let us stand here. Look, they won't let us stand here. Right? Implying that it came from the Wuhan virology lab. It did not come from the Wuhan virology lab. It did not come from the Huanan seafood market either. At the Huanan seafood market, all that happened was the same thing that happened in Scotland a couple of days ago, a super spreader event. Someone with the virus worked at that market and coughed a bit, and in the environment of a wet market, it spreads rapidly. Now, did it come from a pangolin or a mink, as we know now? 100,000 minks have been slaughtered in Spain, but it must have come from a bat. We know that 97% of the RNA comes from a bat.
They don't sell bats.
And the bats that are the bats which the coronavirus comes from, they're called rhino something bats. This type of bat are no bigger than this. You can't eat them. They're too small to eat. Fruit bats you can eat. And by the way, they're eaten in America, the United States. You look up bat restaurant, you'll only find one reference. That reference is Florida, 2012, npr.org. And you'll see there's a woman, peculiar enough, a vegetarian, gives up vegetarianism in order to try smoked bat at a restaurant in Florida. How do you catch coronavirus from a bat? If a bat flies at you, gets caught in your hair, bats move around. When they move around, they can tell where they are and where insects are by echolocation, a sort of sonar. So they scream and squeal and shout when they move around. When they do that, they release viruses from their mouths. And therefore, anyone in a cave, and there are records of this, transmissions of viruses from bats to humans directly in caves in Southeast Asia. And therefore we have to ask ourselves where the virus actually came from. Now, funnily enough, if you want to investigate that, all you've got to do is do some searches. Pneumonia, respiratory disease of unknown origin. And you will find Fairfax, Virginia, July 2019, long before Wuhan. You will find the United Kingdom, an outbreak in a care home in Britain, unknown origin, never investigated whether it was coronavirus. You found only last month, in March 2019, nearly a year before the outbreak in Wuhan, they've detected coronavirus in the sewage system in Spain. So don't come with the argument coronavirus came from China. There is no evidence that it originated in China. It was first detected in China, but there's no evidence it came from China. And yet those sources of evidence that are public domain around the world of outbreaks of extremely similar ailments, double pneumonia, sudden death, rapid death, care home outbreaks, large-scale infections, these are recorded and yet have never been investigated. Why? Because the purpose of the campaign as to the Chinese virus has nothing to do with the virus and everything to do with China. America wants conflict with China, and that's the Democrats and the Republicans and the British government. They don't want a war because they know they'd lose. They want to stimulate a number of conflicts and create a hysteria in the minds of the people, which have been made susceptible to hysteria because of the virus. By changing people's habits, making them wash their hands all the time, put on masks when they don't need masks, tell them you need a mask in your shop when you don't, have people wandering around the streets with masks on all the time, fearful of the virus. This is because it is a campaign by the establishment to create a psychosis in the minds of the people, just like Adolf Hitler created psychosis in the minds of the people, to prepare them psychologically for conflict with another people who they do not understand.
Are you talking about the New World Order?
They're not even talking about it.
I'm talking about what's happening in the world, not New Order. What's actually happening today is visible, clear, and stated by the governments of Britain, America, and other countries. India, for example.
Public Health England.
Indians have been whipped up into hysteria against China. Why? Because hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of Indians are about to die of coronavirus. That's why. So you need an enemy to distract. Simple as that. I've been speaking for a while. I'm going to call a halt. Thanks very much. See you again.
It says on Public Health England it was downgraded on the 19th of March.
I'm familiar with that. I won't go into that. Thanks very much. See you guys later.
Well, downgraded to what?
Non-highly infectious contagious disease.
So close to
It says as of 19th of March 2020, COVID-19.